Welcome back, everyone, to the second lesson of our intensive course. We are in for a truly exciting study today as we continue our journey into covenant theology. Today, our class will be divided into three parts: the Abrahamic Covenant, Part 1, Faith, a topical study, and the Abrahamic Covenant, Part 2. So that's what we'll be looking at today. Now, last time we had an introduction to what covenant theology is, why it's so important, and we also went through our very first covenant story. And indeed, the first covenant recorded in the Bible, the Edenic covenant, which God made with Adam and Eve. So today we are carrying on in that story, following the making of the world and mankind breaking the covenant God made with them. Now, Genesis chapters 1 to 11 spans a timeline of about 1,500 years. But all of Genesis chapters 12 through to 50 is just 300 years. In other words, the writer of Genesis seems to be fast forwarding through the story. He's in a hurry, eager to get to the story of Abraham. And once he gets to this chapter in the story, the writer slows down and takes his time more, because this part of the story is so important in the greater narrative. And this is what we're going to be studying today, the Abrahamic Covenant. But before we get there, we are told a bit about what's happening in the world following the breaking of the Edenic relationship, the Edenic covenant. We can, for example, read this in Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 and 11. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every imagining of the human heart was only evil all the time. And verse 11, now the earth was corrupt before God, the earth was full of violence. In this and other texts, we are told the state of humankind before the flood. The description is violence, filled with wickedness, every thought is evil. The earth is described as being filled with violence and corruption. But what is evil? We may have thoughts about it now. We have a whole baggage of understanding of what evil is. But as we are going through the biblical story, at this point, evil has not yet been defined. It has not been clarified. And it's interesting because the author seems to be writing like everybody just automatically knows what evil is, as though it's common knowledge. We are told about some other events which take place following Eden. What else has changed in the world between the breaking of the Edenic covenant and Abraham? Well, in Eden, God is in direct and close contact with human beings. But following the covenant breaking, there is a separation taking place in relationships. One is the obvious vertical separation, so a distance between God and human beings. And secondly, there is a horizontal separation, a distancing in the relationships between human being and human being. We find this exemplified in several stories. In the story of Cain and Abel, Genesis 4, where brother kills brother. Another example is found in the story about the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11. Here we have a story about the breakdown of language, of communication. The breaking of the Edenic covenant appears to make all connections and relationships, both vertical and horizontal, break down. Now, the flood is another significant event taking place between Eden and Abraham. If you remember, we mentioned how when mankind broke the covenant with God, God didn't just erase them and start again. The start again option may have seemed to us like the better option. Just wipe the slate clean and start over. Make a new Adam and Eve. Hope that they make better choices the next time round. But the flood is a significant story because it proves something. The flood is proof that simply ending the lives of sinners doesn't eradicate sin. The flood doesn't fix or end violence in the world. Just clicking delete doesn't get rid of the virus. And so, with all these stories unfolding, Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, Noah, now we as readers end up in a place thinking, well, what now? What is going to move the narrative forward? And it is at this point that we arrive at Abraham. Let's get some background story on this new character. Genesis 11:27 to 30. This is the genealogy of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. So, this is the introduction we get to this new story character, Abram. And then the story continues. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Verse 7. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Now this interaction seems important. Why? Because God is speaking to a human being? Well, yes, but especially because of how he's speaking to him. Here, God is speaking using covenant language. And we know that when God speaks in covenants, he is telling us something important. Like we said, the format of God's speech to Abram fits the framework of a covenant. It is God initiated, God is providing, it is one-sided in nature, him saying, "I will give you these things." And there is no mention of a deal, no negotiation, no mention of Abram having earned this gift. Here we also find similar language mirroring the Edenic covenant language. "I will bless you. I will make a barren woman bear life." God makes promises. God gives land. God charges Abraham with something to go to this new land. Now, the story in Genesis 12 is a striking story. Why? Because God is saying to an idol-worshipping old man from the land which would later be Babylon, located in today's Iran, "Leave your land and everything you know." This doesn't seem like a list of good qualifications. Why would Abram go? Well, if Abram does go, then he is answering God, yes, I will enter a covenant with you. Let's sum up what promises God made to Abram in this interaction. God promises, I will bless you, make your name great, make you a blessing, blessing those who bless you and cursing those who curse you, bless all families of earth through you, and make a nation from you, so I will give you children, descendants. And in response to these rather ostentatious promises, verse 4 says, and Abram went. How do you agree to a covenant with God? Well, in this case, we are told that Abram responded by going. It would then appear that he believes God. Here, the reader who's been paying attention in Genesis 3 would begin to lean forward in their seat. Because what's happening here in Abram's story is beginning to echo what God has promised earlier to Adam and Eve. We can remind ourselves of that promise. I will destroy the serpent by the woman's seed or descendant. In other words, one of Eve's children is going to crush the enemy who brought death to you. And here, God is promising a descendant to a man called Abram. Here, the promise which was made back in Eden is being fleshed out, expanded upon. Something is being added in this new covenant God is making with Abram. And this new detail is that Abram, your seed, will not only crush your enemy, but be a blessing to the world. And years later, Paul writes about this very thing in Galatians 3:8. The scriptures, foreseeing that God would consider the Gentiles righteous when they live by trusting and by faith, told the good news to Abraham in advance by saying, through you, all nations will be blessed. If you recall, in the beginning of Genesis, the story revealed God to be other-centered by giving away power and asking his humans to do the same, by serving all they were asked to rule over. Here, the covenant with Abraham is still following that tone, that focus. It is being other-centered. In Eden, by two human beings being blessed, all the world would be blessed. Now God is saying, Abraham, by one family, your family, all families will be blessed. By one people, all people will be blessed. And this is worth paying attention to, as it seems to be a pattern in the way God works. Whatever good thing God is giving is an invitation to pass on that gift to others. Of course, this may all sound nice and simple, but as readers, we may think, this story is still full of problems. God can talk all he likes about the future, children, being a blessing. But the reality is, Abram is old, childless, and an idolater. Let's continue in the text to see how this all unfolds. So Abram has left his home, and by doing so has agreed to God's covenant and its terms. He has entered into a covenant relationship with God by going. But we're going to read about some of the things which happened following this agreement as we get to know more about this character, Abram. We will look at two stories which took place right after Abram has set out from his home. We begin with the first story in Genesis 12, beginning from verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She's my sister,' so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So that was story number 1. Story number 2 begins in the next chapter, chapter 13. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything they had, and Lot went with them. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men part company. This story is continued into chapter 14, where we're told that they were kings in the region who were warring against each other. And during one of these battles, it affects Lot because in verse 12 we read, "They," that is, the four warring kings, "also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom." A man who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. The king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "With raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, 'I made Abram rich.' I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten, and the share that belongs to the men who went with me, to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them have their share. To sum it up, this character Abram, which we've been introduced to, seems to act faithful in one moment and unfaithful in the next. On the one hand, Abram does very covenant reflecting things. For example, he gives away land to Lot, reflecting that godlike attitude of giving away power, which we've talked about, Genesis 13, 5-13. Abram also seems brave and takes responsibility for those around him. He goes into battle in order to rescue his nephew who has been kidnapped. Abram is also respected and seen as a regal king, so he rules, as is exemplified in Genesis 14, when the king of Sodom comes out of his city to meet Abram. In those days, the king doesn't come out to meet you, you go in to meet him. And so the king of Sodom coming out to meet Abram indicates that the king of Sodom saw himself and Abram at minimum as equals. Also, the king of Salem, who was called Melchizedek, a man who was also called the high priest of God, said, "Blessed be Abram," serving as an affirmation that God was with Abram and recognized by God. So, these are the good moments. But on the other hand, Abram shows himself unworthy of being in a covenant with God, much less being a channel of God's message or blessing to the world. This is made clear in examples such as when he went to Egypt and lied about Sarai being merely his sister, Genesis 12, 10-20. Now, you may look at this text and think, Abram was just trying to cover his butt to keep himself from being murdered by someone who wanted his wife for themselves. But there was more to what happened in Egypt than a little white lie being told. Because if you recall, because of Abram's actions, he, 1, put his wife in jeopardy, though God had said he would give Abram descendants, and now Abram has sent off his wife. And 2, a plague is brought on Egypt because of Abram. In this story, Abram is acting opposite to his calling. He acts as a curse to other people. And shockingly, and I'd like us to pay especially attention to this, in Genesis chapter 12, it isn't Abram, but Pharaoh, ruler of Egypt, who acted honorably. Pharaoh is upset that he has taken another man's wife, and in many ways, this is surprising because Pharaoh, someone we might in retrospect call a Gentile, a heathen, an idol worshiper, calls both lying and adultery wrong. So far, Abram's covenant with God isn't going great. God acts as a promise keeper, sticking to the terms he's laid down, while Abram acts like a promise breaker. And it's after these two stories that we arrive at chapter 15. Genesis 15, 1-6. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Don't be afraid, Abram. I am your protector. Your reward will be very great." Abram replied, "Lord God, what good will your gifts be to me if I continue childless? And Eliezer from Damascus inherits my possessions. You haven't given me a child." Abram continued, "So someone born in my house will be my heir." But the word of the Lord came to him. "This man will not be your heir. No, your heir will be a child from your own body." Then he brought him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if you can count them. Your descendants will be that many. Abram believed in the Lord, and the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. So here God comes and speaks with Abram. God has already promised Abram descendants and to make them a great nation. But here Abram questions, how, God? How are you going to do what you said you're going to do? I have no children, and my heir is Eliezer, who was Abram's closest relative and his natural heir. So, how, God, are you going to make me a father and a nation? And God replies, he doesn't tell Abram how he's going to keep his promise. He just repeats that he will. Almost like a married couple renewing their vows, God here is renewing his covenant promises to Abram. God says, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars, and this will come from your own body, not through your relative. And how does Abram respond? The text says Abram believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. This simply means Abram was declared righteous, which equals being right with God, being right in your relationship with God, because he believed. This is an important occasion, because here in Genesis 15, we've just had what being righteous is given a definition. The story continues, verse 7. Genesis 15, 7-8. He, the Lord, also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and to take possession of it. But Abram said, Lord God, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? And I'd like us to take notice of this. Abram is still asking questions. But we've just been told he believed in the earlier verse. It would seem that believing does not mean not having questions or doubts. Interesting. Now, we mentioned earlier that making covenants or cutting a covenant was common practice in this part of the world at the time. If you recall, people made covenants with each other all the time. Today, when we make a covenant or a contract or a deal with someone, what do we usually do? We sign paperwork most of the time. We put things in writing. Sometimes people even make verbal deals and they swear to uphold them, like saying, I swear on the Bible, or I swear on my great aunt's grave that I won't lick the cat. Well, in those days, they so-called signed their covenant in a rather different way. Here's the way they did it. They would kill an animal, often a cow, but sometimes a sheep or a goat. They would cut the animal in half, and then they would each walk through the middle of the animal parts. This was a symbolic act which said, if I break this agreement, if I break the terms of our covenant, let what has happened to this animal happen to me. It now begins to make sense that they use the phrase to cut a covenant. So, as you've probably picked up on, when it comes to covenant making, it was very serious business in those days. It wasn't a lightly made, off-handed promise. You were swearing your life on it. And people would literally be killed for breaking a covenant, as was part of the agreement. Secondly, there was another existing custom in those days. This went that if one party broke the covenant, the other party could accept responsibility for both parts of the deal. For example, if I made a deal with Jonathan that we would buy a motorcycle together, and to pay for the motorcycle, I owed 10 potatoes and he owed 3 chickens, but then I didn't have the potatoes to pay for the bike. Instead of me going to jail or being cut in half, Jonathan could say, "It's okay. I accept your part, and I will not only give 3 chickens that I owe, but the potatoes that you owe too." Now that we understand how this all works and the nature of covenant deals in those days, let's carry on reading. The Lord has just said, "I will give you this land." And Abraham has just said, "How do I know that? How do I know that you'll do as you said?" Genesis 15 from verse 9. So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a cow, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abram brought all these things to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. Birds of prey swooped down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. So, based on what we've learned, we understand what's going on here, and so did Abram. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will judge that nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here." When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites." Hold on. What just happened? What just happened in this scene? Let's unpack this. We've said that there was a customary way of making a covenant with someone at the time and the culture Abram lived in. To seal a covenant today, we might sign a piece of paper, a contract. But back in those days, the custom was different. Instead of signing a piece of paper, as we said, they would cut animals in half, and then each party would walk down the middle between the halves of the carcasses as an act of agreeing to the covenant. The very literal implication was that by walking between the animals, if I break my side of the covenant, then let what has happened to these animals happen to me. It was a very real way of swearing on your life that you'll stick to a deal and keep a promise. This was the usual way. And this is also the way God asked Abram to proceed. But if anyone has shown themselves to be unreliable of these two parties, it was Abram. And according to custom, as we've said, Abram was meant to walk between the animals, but he didn't. As we've just read, God appears as something which looks like a pot and a flaming torch, and he passes between the pieces while Abram stands back and watches. That means that as was also permitted in their customs, if you remember, one party can take on the responsibilities of the other in the covenant, as in the case of me owing potatoes and Jonathan paying for them. That means that here in Genesis 15, God was saying to Abraham, if I break this covenant, let what has happened to these animals happen to me. If you break this covenant, let what has happened to these animals happen to me. God has just accepted both parts of the responsibilities of the terms of the covenant relationship. So, to sum up the Abrahamic covenant so far, God makes promises to Abraham and a covenant with him. It is initiated by God. He seals the covenant relationship by taking the oath of the animal sacrifice, accepting the consequences if either breaks it. Belief in God's promises is defined as the correct, the right covenant response. In other words, the right way to respond to God making a covenant with you is belief. Meaning a true covenant response is trusting God will do what he said he'll do. That brings us to the end of the first part of our class today. We're going to have a short break and then return for the second part of today's class, a word study on faith. See you in a bit. Welcome back, everyone. In our next section, we are going to be taking a step to the side from Abraham's narrative, and we will be looking at the topic of faith. And the reason we're doing this is that we've heard the word faith mentioned in the story of Abraham, or the word belief. And we've just looked at how Abraham was considered righteous or right with God because he had faith, because he believed what God promised. In fact, Abraham becomes famous for his faith. They are still writing about it all the way in the New Testament in Hebrews 11, thousands of years later. Because of this, it's worth pausing here and making sure that we actually understand what faith is before continuing the story. Because faith is a commonly used word along with belief, but there's a lot of misinformation going around about it. So, in our class last week, we said that covenant is the language God chooses to reveal who he is to us. And covenant is the kind of relationship God chooses to do that in. And we're going to be repeating this many times. A covenant with God is where it's always he who makes the first move. And now it seems that, based on Genesis 15, that the correct human response to God's offer of a covenant is a faith response, to believe. But what does faith mean? And furthermore, what is a faith response? Well, that's what we're going to be taking a closer look at now. We're going to be exploring 4 overarching points in this section, and we'll dive straight in. The first point concerns the word itself, the word faith, and how we interpret it. Language is always changing, and the connotations which a word may have held 50 years ago can be very different from the baggage it carries around today. Here are a few examples of that in English. Awful. This used to mean the exact same thing as awesome, but awful over the years came to mean the complete opposite. It became a negative word. Another example is the word nice. Nice entered English from classic Latin, from the word nescius, meaning ignorant. And so between the 1300s through to the 1600s, it was used to mean silly, foolish, or ignorant. And it was only by the 18th century that nice came to mean what it does today. And so, in a similar way, faith is a word which has changed in our minds, in our culture, and in the way we talk about God and religion. In the past, faith, trust, and belief were more interchangeable words in English. But today, faith is a word many Christians have come to associate with either their own strength or character or with a feeling. To many present day Bible readers, having faith is understood as having a confident, warm feeling. And as a result, they try to produce faith in themselves by manufacturing this feeling of faith, drumming it up at will, thinking this is what God asks of them. Now, because of this thinking, whether we're aware of it or not, faith may become associated with our own performance and ability. Faith is a topic which is very central to one's religion if you consider yourself a Protestant Christian. In the days of Luther, when he went up against the teachings of the now called Roman Catholic Church, he argued that the Bible tells us that faith is what enables a person to become right in their relationship with God, when that faith is faith in God's grace. But because of what we've already mentioned, this perception that faith is a confident or warm feeling, Protestant Christians today can quickly come to remove this Reformation pillar of justified by faith and replace it with earning salvation by producing in myself feelings of faith and confidence. If you remember, any covenant with God is God initiated. It is the last will and testament, a gift. And in the same way, the Bible presents faith, the right faith, as always being a gift from God. It cannot be produced by people. If we thought we could produce faith in ourselves, then this would be just another way to say that we can, through our own efforts, work our way to salvation, or in this case, feel our way to salvation. Faith does not mean having warm, fuzzy feelings towards God. Also, if faith simply meant believing that God exists, then how would that distinguish us from the demons? They too believe, as it says in James 2:17-19. They know God exists. So this is all to say, it's challenging using the word faith today because of our baggage and our misinterpretations of what faith is. It can create all sorts of problems. A very useful practice to try to push against this false understanding of the word of faith is when reading the Bible, try mentally replacing the word faith with trust. A very few translations already do this in the text, but a vast majority of the English Bible translations opt to translate the Greek word pistis as faith and its derivatives as faithfulness. Some Protestant Christians have said, God produces the good works in me, and I produce the faith. But even from the very first chapters of Genesis, we are told that humanity is completely and utterly dependent on God for everything. If you remember, Adam was given life, rulership, food, and he was 100% dependent on God to provide everything from his home to the very breath in his lungs. And faith is no different. Saying God produces the good works in me and I produce the faith sounds nice, but is misinformed. We are more dependent on God than that. to the point where we need Him to produce faith in us, as well as any good works that might result. This is why using the word trust can be so helpful in shifting our thinking. Why? Because trust is relational. We associate trust with relationship, and trust is often a more accurate reflection of the original biblical text and what it is saying. Reading it as trust can radically reset our focus from being me-centered, so what I do, my efforts, to being God-centered, from focusing on the faith which I produce to the one I'm trusting in and depending on to produce it in me. And the Bible is littered with this idea. Here are just a few examples. In Romans 12:3, it says, "For I am telling every single one of you, through the grace that has been given to me, not to have exaggerated ideas about your own importance. Instead, develop a sober estimate of yourself based on the standard which God has given to each of you, namely, trust." So God gives trust. And in Ephesians 2:8-9, "For it is by grace you have been saved through trust. And this is not from yourselves. It is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." And again in Luke 17:5, the followers of Jesus understood this truth, and they showed their understanding by saying to Jesus, "Increase our trust." In other words, they ask for their trust to be increased. And why would they ask this of someone who would be unable to do that? Someone who couldn't help them or make that happen? So, to sum up this first point, the word trust is more inclined towards the relational and can help us move from attempting to manufacture a feeling to acknowledging our dependency on God's gift and provision of that gift. We move on to our second overarching point concerning faith, the origin of trust. The writer of the book of Hebrews calls Jesus the origin of our faith or our trust. Following listing off a long line of people from Israel's history who are described as having acted by faith in various ways, the writer concludes this with a charge to fix our eyes on Jesus. In fact, the Hebrews writer calls Jesus the author and completer of our faith. What a strange and beautiful thing. Not only is Jesus meant to be the one we trust in, but he is the author of that very trust. He is where our faith begins. He is its source. But what does that mean for us? Firstly, it means that if anyone lacks faith, they can take that problem to Jesus. After all, he is the right place to go with that issue. I mean, if he is the source of our faith, then we needn't struggle alone trying to produce feelings of faith in ourselves before approaching him. We don't have to be afraid to talk to God because we lack faith. Instead, like the father who asked Jesus to heal his son, we can cry, "I do believe, help my unbelief." Secondly, it means that we needn't be anxious about the state of our faith. We don't have to carefully monitor its levels, trying to measure it, comparing it to others, or where we think it ought to be. We don't have to wonder if our trust in God is growing fast enough. We don't have to suffer from performance anxiety. Jesus is called not only the beginning, but the completer of our faith, meaning he is the one who's going to grow it. He is the one who's going to nourish it, refine it, mature it. He is the one in our relationship who is going to make up for our weaknesses and shortcomings. As with covenants, he is the initiator and he is the finisher. You don't have to worry about being the author and completer of your own faith. We are not the captains at the helm of this ship. The Bible is telling us, stick with God. He will finish what he started. And again, these ideas are written in Hebrews 12:2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and completer of faith, and in Philippians 1:6, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it until the day of Christ Jesus. And as we mentioned earlier in Mark 9:24, instantly the boy's father exclaimed to Jesus, I do trust. Help my lack of trust. So, to summarize our second point, Jesus is the source and the author and the completer of our faith. Our ability to trust in him comes from him, and he is the one to mature it. Our third point looks at the framework in which that trust develops. Now, a key part of building trust is time. We already touched on that in the Abrahamic Covenant study. Trustworthiness is demonstrated in the setting of relationship, and time is the matrix which allows for those trust-growing experiences to play out. When we see that someone is steady and consistent and reliable over time, our trust in them usually tends to grow. If you think about your own human relationships, whether they are personal or professional, credibility is built over time. Integrity is revealed over time. Time unveils to us someone's sincerity. Time shows whether someone is dependable. And time is the backdrop to which experience is gained, and experience fuels trust. Experienced trust. How would you or I decide whether a human being was trustworthy or not? Well, one option is to ask others about their experience with this person. A second option is that we might watch carefully how this person treats others. In professional settings, we might look through reports or work reviews written by previous coworkers or bosses, seeing if the person in question has exhibited integrity and good ethics in the past. We might also begin trusting this person with information, bit by bit increasing the level of sensitivity of the information we share. We might tell them a secret and see if they keep it. And after a while, we might try sharing something intimate which leaves us vulnerable to potential hurt. And all these things are done and tested over time. Now, everyone here in this class and also out there in the greater world are all different. Some of us trust easily, others do not. Some are quickly satisfied by what they have seen, while others experience more of an inner conflict. Some of us who struggle with trust may do so because of injuries sustained in past relationships. But whatever association you may personally have with trusting, it appears that God treats us like the individuals we are. Just like we might slowly build trust with a human being over time, God invites us to spend time experiencing his character, watching how he acts, witnessing his intentions both in our lives and in the lives of others. As we are discovering in this course, the Lord allows us time and history. He allows us to witness him in our own story and other stories. And it appears that God longs to bless us, as was included in his promise to Abraham, to bless all the people of earth. And evidently, struggling with trust, as Abraham did, doesn't discount us from his love or his tireless efforts and gifts. The point here is that we don't have to feel pressured by time, thinking, oh, I need to have this much faith by now. Instead, time becomes a gift, in which trust is allowed to be nourished through all the highs and lows. Again, we find these ideas reflected in texts like Psalms 34:8, "Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Come, taste, experience, see for yourself." Psalm 9:10, "Those who know your name trust in you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you." People are inspired to trust in the Lord because he doesn't leave behind those who want to have a relationship with him. In Jeremiah 17:7, "But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him." Trusting in God seems to be a blessing for a person. So, to summarize our third point, trust is built over time. God allows us to experience his character over time, over our own time and the time of others, and he allows the time for our trust in him to develop. We return to Hebrews chapter 12 to our fourth and final point, an informed faith. We just looked at how time is a matrix which allows experiential trust to be established, nourished, and strengthened. Now we shall be looking at information. For just like time is needed for interpersonal trust to be formed, so is sound information. After the author of Hebrews runs through the list of people in Israel's history who acted by trust in Hebrews 11, the author sums up his point in chapter 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and completer of our trust. Based on this text, our trust is not meant to be an uninformed trust. And, contrary to what some religious voices may claim, it's not meant to be a blind faith either. After all, we can only trust if someone or something is the object of that trust. In other words, trust doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists based on some data, some form of information. The author of Hebrews is pointing to all those people on this list, people in Israel's history, people who trusted that God would do what he said he would do. And fueled by their informed testimony and tried experience with God, the author is saying, now we too can keep moving forward, fixing our eyes on Jesus. This leads us to the following conclusion. Having faith or trusting in God is not meant to be an exercise in ignorance. It's not turning a blind eye. Faith does not equal denseness or naivete or unawareness. We are not being asked to turn our brains off. We are not asked to derive our confidence from a vacuum or conjured up out of thin air. We do not increase our trust in God by reverting to a childish obtuseness or by shutting our eyes to information. In fact, doing any of these things makes for a weak, neutered, unfounded faith that more resembles superstition, tradition, and escapism rather than real, founded, solid knowledge. Now, sadly, many Christians' response to other people's questions about God or about the Christian faith is just believe or just have faith. I've heard things said like, if you knew the answer to that, well, then it wouldn't be faith. You may have said this to someone, you may have had something similar said to you. Often the valid, intellectual, and experiential doubts of others are swept under the carpet with such blanket statements. Doing this fuels the fire of misunderstanding of what faith is. But the author of Hebrews doesn't allow space for this sort of enforced or willful ignorance. Instead, he encourages his audience to consider the testimonies of those gone before, saying, look at the information. Just as we looked earlier at how trust is allowed to be established over time, so is legitimate trust built on a solid foundation of intelligent, tried information and experiences. Wanting to be informed does not mean you lack faith. Asking questions, thinking critically, is not a counter-faith activity. It is not a sin. And you needn't take my word for it. Let's ask ourselves the following question. Why would God tell us what he's doing before he does it? Why would there be prophecies? When he fulfills prophecies, our confidence in him is fueled because he said, this is going to happen. And then when it does, we are shown that the information was sound. We are assured that he's moving purposefully and effectively. We are given reason to believe that just as he kept his word to those in the past, he'll do so in the future too. God can nourish our trust in his character through promises kept in the lives of others. Peter wrote to believers during his day, but treat the Messiah as holy, as Lord in your hearts, while remaining always ready to give a reasoned answer to anyone who asks you to explain the hope you have in you, yet with gentleness and respect. 1 Peter 3:15. Peter is saying, know why you believe what you believe, and don't be ready to give just any answer to someone who is asking you what your hope is based on. He writes, give a reasoned answer. Give an intelligent, mentally analyzed answer. Paul writes to the church in Thessalonica, but do test everything. Hold on to what is good. Don't be mindless sheep. Engage, turn your brain on, observe, and hold on to what is good. Jesus himself says in John 14:11, trust me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. But if you can't, trust in the evidence of the works themselves. Jesus is saying, trust what I'm saying. But if you can't do so, then trust your own eyes and let what I'm doing serve as evidence. And again, Paul wrote to the church of believers in Rome about letting information fuel their faith. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. Romans 15:4. The recordings of these stories from the past have a purpose, that we might be encouraged and have hope. Which brings us to the end of our fourth and final point. So, to summarize what we've talked about in our faith study section, number 1, language changes. It is helpful to use the word trust in place of faith because the word trust more accurately reflects the relational quality and its biblical meaning. It draws our focus to the relational as opposed to making the mistake of thinking we are called to manufacture faith like a feeling. Number 2, secondly, our faith comes from and is matured by God. We don't have to obsess about how much faith we have. We are not good measurers of that. We are called to depend on that just as He is the author, He is also its completer. Thirdly, trust is built over time. God allows human beings time to build relationship and experiences with Him. And fourthly, we are not encouraged to have a blind faith or to be brainless believers. We are called to have an informed faith based on information and intelligent thought, Trust in God is not an exercise in ignorance, but an invitation to consider truth. We are going to have another short break at this time, and when we come back, we will look at the third and final part of our class today, which is the Abrahamic Covenant, Part 2. Right, so welcome back, everybody. We resume our class for the final part of our study today, the Abrahamic Covenant, Part 2. Just in case a few thoughts have faded in our minds while we went off to visit the bathroom or sneak some chocolate cake, let's quickly refresh our memories. God makes a covenant with a man called Abram, first in Genesis 12, and then renewed or repeated in chapter 15. Abram responds yes to God's offer of a covenant relationship by having faith or trust. We've looked at how faith equals trust. So far in the story, trust appears to be the only correct response to God's covenant proposal. In Hebrews 11, we saw how the author gives us a list of people from the biblical storyline who had this trust response to God. Abram is included on that list. And when God repeats his covenant promises in Genesis 15 and re-shows his commitment to Abram, he did this with the cut animals in half ritual, which was common at the time. Except we saw that he did something different, because God walks through the middle of the animals and Abram doesn't. This was God saying, if I or you break the conditions of this covenant, let what has happened to these animals happen to me. And with that refresher, we are going to carry on looking at what happens after Genesis 15. To begin with, we're going to look at an overview of all the things God has promised to Abraham so far, the gifts he says he's going to give him in their covenant relationship. The promise of land. As you can see by the texts, these promises are not said once, but repeated and reaffirmed many times. The promise of descendants, a nation. The promise of blessings and curses. The promise to be a blessing to others. As we've established, Abraham was said to have faith. But let's move on to look at some stories of how he actually acts within this relationship. Basically, we're taking a closer look at two people in a relationship, Abraham and God. How do they treat each other? How do each of them act? Let's continue the story as we go to Genesis chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. But she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai his wife took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The messenger of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, "Slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I am running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the messenger of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and acknowledge her." The messenger added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The messenger of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her: "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Beer Lachai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Abram had been living in the land called Canaan for 10 years so far, and still has no children. Promises have been made, but Sarai, his wife, decides to look at this situation practically. She says, "Look, Abram, I'm clearly not going to have any children. And yes, God said to you that you will have children from your own body, but my body doesn't seem to be part of the plan. We need to move things along now. Take my slave Hagar and use her as a surrogate." Right. So, yes, God has made a promise to Abram, and Abram doesn't fight Sarai's idea, and he follows through on it. Perhaps God needs a little help. Perhaps we're meant to be figuring out how God's promise is going to become reality. Perhaps it's on me to make this happen. Ultimately, Abram's decision leads to a lot of misery for all parts involved. But at least, we might think, Abram now has a son, a biological son and heir, Ishmael. Let's carry on reading chapter 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am God Almighty. Walk in my presence and be without blame. I will make my covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers." Abram fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God." So, God comes again and speaks to Abram, and what he has to say doesn't feel initially new. We've heard this before. God is saying, "I want a covenant relationship with you, and I promise on my end to make your descendants many, to make your descendants a nation, and to give you the land around you." But here, God also adds something which you may have noticed. He expands on the covenant. He says, "I am not only making a covenant with you and just for today, it will be between me and all your descendants, and this covenant will stand forever." God also adds to the promise, saying that kings will come from Abram's line. And the final change we find in the text Abram's name is changed by God to Abraham, meaning father of many. Let's carry on from verse 9. Then God said to Abraham, "As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner, those who are not of your offspring. My covenant in your body is to be an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." Verse 15, God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." So, hold on. Okay. In God's covenant with Abraham, God says, "I will give you these gifts. I will give you a son. I will make these things happen." These are the terms of our covenant. And Abraham has gone off and broken the covenant terms by trying himself to implement God's promise to have a son. Abraham tried to make it happen himself. He did this with Hagar. Now God is saying, "What you did with Hagar, that's not my plan. That was not the covenant we made. I will make these things happen, not you. Come now, let us renew our relationship. I renew my covenant with you. I reaffirm my commitment, my promises to you that I will make all these things happen." And then he says, "This will be the sign of our renewed covenant relationship. You and all males in your household will be circumcised." Now, if Abraham thought he had been faced with an impossible situation before, because he's 100 years old with a barren wife, and now God is even ruling out the option of using a surrogate, well, then this last thing must have truly thrown him for a loop. It's the final nail in the coffin, because God is now saying you will all be circumcised. Let's break this down and explore why this is so shocking. Abraham thinks, "I know how children are made. I have a tool with which one does that. And now God is saying to me, you are to circumcise this instrument." And this is no high class, modern, sterilized scalpels in the best hospital in Switzerland sort of surgery. This is circumcision, performed in a tent, not by professional surgeons, perhaps with clumsy tools. The end product would probably not be pretty. Abraham thought he had the tool with which to make God's plan reality. But now he faces a worse situation, a potentially mutilated or injured penis, and still a barren wife. This sounds like complete and utter impossibility. This is God saying, "I am the one going to do this impossible thing." And in case there is any doubt in your mind that this will be done by me and not you, now to some modern readers, circumcision seems barbaric. But it may surprise some Bible readers that circumcision is not originally a Jewish thing. It wasn't even an exclusively people of God thing. This predates the Jewish nation, and God didn't invent circumcision. To be circumcised was not a foreign or strange act in this region of the world at that time. Many of the surrounding peoples in Canaan and beyond carried out circumcision as an act of their religion, as a sacrifice to gods, or a cultural rite of passage into manhood. There are still cultures today in which circumcision is carried out on males, and it has nothing to do with Judaism or Israelite history. Circumcision is a man-made invention. So God isn't making up a new ritual here. He is simply taking a ritual common in Canaan, taking something familiar and saying, Abraham, you will now do this. God is repurposing a recognizable custom to now be a symbolic act of something deeper. Let's continue reading verse 17. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Abraham is again coming back to and pushing his plan, his method of accomplishing what God has promised, saying quite hintingly, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Abraham is here going, I know what you're saying, God, but may I bring up Ishmael again? An excellent candidate for the job, because that idea seems like a more realistic and viable route to me. Verse 19. Then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. When he had finished speaking with Abraham, God went up from him. It is worth noticing here how incredibly patient God is as he interacts with Abraham. He is willing to repeat himself, to affirm again and again what he has promised. He even allows Abraham to, I don't know if we should call it argue with him, but he has a back and forth with him. And yet God stands by what he says. Abraham, I will bless Ishmael and take care of him. But my plan, my covenant promise to bless all people of the earth through your descendants, that will come through a son Sarah will carry, and you'll name him Isaac. Following this interaction, we read in verse 23. On that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all those born in his household or bought with his money, every male in his household, and circumcised them, as God told him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and his son Ishmael was 13. Abraham and his son Ishmael were both circumcised on that very day. And every male in Abraham's household, including those born in his household or bought from a foreigner, was circumcised with him. So we are left with this strange, this odd situation. Cutting a covenant has taken on a whole new literal meaning. And I'd like us to keep this fresh in our minds because it's so important. Abraham did something wrong by trying to make God's promises come true, by taking things into his own hands and using his own methods to try to make these promises happen. If you recall, The covenant they made with the animals cut in half, the covenant terms were that only God walked between the animals. So he was the one who was going to keep the terms of the covenant. By Abraham trying to take things into his own hands, he's actually breaking the terms. He's breaking the covenant. Despite this, God patiently reminds Abraham of who is going to bring all of this to reality. And not only that, he adds to the promise. Or you might say, God elaborates on the details of the covenant promise. He brings Abraham in on some more of the details. And now the promise includes kings. This suggests to us that in a covenant relationship with God, we are not always told all the information in one go, or even told how we're going to get there. We may only be initially told by God, I'm going to make these things happen. We move on to chapter 18 from verse 1. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it, and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There, in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." So we've read in this story that not only is God willing to keep reaffirming and repeating his promises, but God shows up in person, physically coming to Abraham's tent, making a home visit to assure him again for certain and in person, "I am going to do this." The next story we find in chapter 20 from verse 1. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman." Now Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, 'She's my sister'? And didn't she also say, 'He is my brother'? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I've kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all who belong to you will die." Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials, and when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done." And Abimelech asked Abraham, "What was your reason for doing this?" Abraham replied, "I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Because she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, 'This is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham. And he returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, 'My land is before you. Live wherever you like.' To Sarah he said, 'I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated.'" Surely, we think, after chapter 18, surely now that God has shown up at Abraham's front door, now he trusts that God will protect his life and has his back and will let him have a son. But that isn't the case. Reading this chapter feels like deja vu, a record stuck on repeat. Abraham does the exact same thing in Gerar as he did in Egypt. He tried to protect his own life, and by doing so, jeopardizes his wife, the woman through which God said he'd keep his promise. And Abraham has deceived other people because of his fear. This is not wholehearted trust. This is cowardice and self-preservation. And once again, Abraham isn't a blessing to other nations or peoples. Quite the opposite. Others are acting more honorably than he is. People he and we might dub as idol worshippers or heathens. Surely now, we must think, God is done. I mean, Abraham hasn't changed, has he? It's the same old stuff over and over again. Who would want to have any form of agreement with this unreliable person? Well, all is revealed in chapter 21. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." This impossible thing has happened. Nobody can take credit for it, saying, this child and his descendants exist because of human will or ability. God has kept the first part of his promise to Abraham to make his descendants as numerous as the stars. God kept his promise and gave him a biological son with Sarah. We begin to get this impression of God's character. So far, it appears he keeps his word. Not every one of his promises have taken place yet, but we're going to read on in the story to find out if they do, and how the God who walked between the animals acts next. So that was our class for today, the Abrahamic Covenant. And next time we will dive into the Mosaic Covenant. For now, thank you all for joining us, and I wish you all a very good remainder of your day. See you next time.